This is Gnosis of the Body, where we explore embodied wisdom in healing the mind-body split through personal stories, using Jungian depth psychology, mythology, and following collective trends, and following wisdom stories of the body. Yoga is a body-based practice coming from a spiritual discipline, which the way it was taught to me, and of course this always depends on one's own teacher, the way it was taught to me, it had the aim of quieting the mind and focusing the attention, I would say, the consciousness in the body and in sensation. And the more and more I practiced physical pose yoga, aka asana yoga for those who aren't down with their Sanskrit, I learned that indeed there was a purpose to every single exercise. So for that example, when you practice balance poses, if all of a sudden your mind started wandering, you would fall out of balance in the pose, or rather I would fall out of balance in the pose. And so that there was a metaphor behind every single thing. Grounded positions really did quiet your mind when you were down on the floor. Ones that required strength required more fire. I remember reading Iyengar, and he said, of the ballerinas that came to learn yoga from him, that asana had nothing to teach them. Because they were so physically fit, they were so flexible, asana had nothing to teach them. So I will always say that if you're out of shape, if you're inflexible, you're lucky, and this is a great moment for you to come to yoga. I, myself, do have a natural flexibility, but when I started yoga, I was burned out. I was overweight. I did not have any of these physical abilities, and it was very, very hard for me to do even the most basic things. So I was very fortunate, I now say, because I learned a lot from asana. The thing about quieting the mind, at least in the way that I was taught through my root teachers, is that the body feels, the mind thinks, is what my root teacher always said. And we always dismiss that the body has any wisdom to give us. Ram Dass, I was listening to a speech of his the other day on his podcast, which I highly recommend you subscribe to, which is on YouTube and podcasts. And they've kept all his beautiful speeches and lectures and recordings there. He was discussing how when he worked in psychology, how incredibly sexist they were because they believed that power came from using your rational mind. And they openly said, he said, pity us, we were so sexist at the time. They openly said intuition is for women and that intuition was weak. And I believe those that do not understand spirituality, that look at sort of us yogi tribe and dismiss us, sense inherently that there is feminine wisdom coming through it. Now, I wish to clarify this because when I say feminine, I do not mean female. I mean anyone who is in touch with the body, because throughout history, and I have plenty of examples which I'll use later when I feel like getting out the books of quotes that I have, that throughout history the body has been compared to the feminine and the female body in particular, particularly by the Catholic Church. And not always in Christianity, because I was studying at one point 1400s and 1500s Christianity, and sexuality was not always condemned. This comes from a particular French resource that I have, which I will have to translate in order to share with you if I ever choose to. But in reading this historical book, I was very interested to see that sexuality was openly discussed at one point, at least in France, by ministers for their congregation, and it was welcomed as, married couples for procreation. But it was acknowledged, and it was not entirely sinful because they were noted as being very bodily, and that time was very bodily. There were plagues, you worked with your body, life and death and birth came in very visceral and integral ways that we have now pushed to the side, just as we have pushed the body to the side. And so, to get back to it, by quieting the mind and once coming back into the body in sensation and conscious awareness through the practice of yoga in my own personal experience, because it is a practice which comes from a spiritual discipline, it allowed me to get back in touch with what I would call source. And for the body to come back into relationship with its source is what was given to me specifically because I was able to go away for a long period, sort of monastic or what I called yoga nun period, for 30 days in my yoga teacher training. For me, for so long, I'd been forcing my body to serve my mind at its own expense. I had no respect for the body. I had no respect for it as a resource. I really didn't even have the concept at all that the body was connected to a greater source, that it needed reconnection to in order to serve my desires. I mean, as a metaphor, I would really say that it was a bit like using something that requires a battery and then never recharging that battery or never replacing that battery. And what this looked like in my life was a constant state of work and work travel, relaxation. I use that word in quotes, if you can imagine air quotes around it. Relaxation was only being reached by me via outside substances, which were in fact burning me up further. Lots of wine, which was part of my job, and I did enjoy, but it was a bit more of a forced wind down than a real rest. I wasn't really capable of giving myself the permission to let go and to truly, truly rest. So I would really just sort of fall into a burned out exhaustion when I quote unquote rested on nights and weekends. And because we work in this culture, this society that has adopted this behavior where this was normal, where this was lauded, this was echoed all around me by friends. And it's really only through a series of fortunate events and social structures and gifts that I was able to step back as fully as I was. And that I am now able to come back from that time or that journey, or, well, at this point it's been 9 years of work and study, to be able to impart this particular perspective to you. The French have a verb, ressourcer, and the root is source, meaning water, spring from the earth. When a French person refers to taking time out from the world, particularly with the intent to relax and to restore their vital energies, they use this verb, ressourcer. Il faut se ressourcer. Il faut me ressourcer. I have to go resource myself. When I was working, I often saw this verb in press releases I was translating from spas and water centres, of which there's many in France. And I used to work for the French tourist office, so this is part of what I was promoting, but not anything I was benefiting from personally. But France really is a great state which employs all of these methods for its people. The history of spas is very, very rich. It is, in fact, something that is sometimes included in their state health system for people to use. We working at the French government did not quite have the salaries to go in our spare time to enjoy these lavish places of the press releases which I was translating. But there are spas in France where they're more affordable and available to the general populace widely throughout the whole country. But the point is that this was an aspect of their culture, just even the word and the fact these places existed, which, you know, as I worked for their government, as I became a citizen, I really deeply appreciated. I learned a great deal about the values of what is really important through this French culture. You know, coming from the American culture that I did, we're really taught via our capitalistic culture to not value ourselves, and in specific, I mean our bodies. What I appreciate about my transition to yoga is self-attention to my body, breath, and peace in my mind became my job. It was my job to give my body a long stretch session, for example, to immerse myself in this practice and to give myself permission to give my body what it needed. I had gone so deeply into being a workaholic that I needed to swing that extreme the other way. And because the culturally attuned, shame-filled side of me really felt that it would appear lazy to take care of myself and to just be indulging in this body-based spiritual discipline, I had to take on the extra excuse of like, yes, well, I'm training to be a yoga teacher. And it was something I actually passionately had wanted for a very long time, kind of in the same way little girls want to be ballerinas. I did want to be the woman at the front of the room telling everyone, stick your leg up in the air and twist it behind your ear. I'm kidding. I'm not that kind of competitive, like pretzel twist yogi teacher. But because very much I didn't want to appear lazy to society, and because we have this doctrine of people who take care of their bodies, who take time out specifically to, again, that verb, ressourcer, people who take a break when they're really at their breaking point, when they really have nothing left to give. We've got this athletic culture, which, okay, that's great if you're an athlete. Push it to the end. Okay, that's fine if you're building muscle in the gym. Push to your limit. But we cannot apply this around everywhere. And unfortunately, again, coming from an American linear upward progression, perpetually capitalistic, pursuing bigger, better, bigger, better, bigger, better culture, this is what we did. And so what I deeply appreciated learning from the French was this concept of ressourcer, joie de vivre, and that means joy of life, going back to the source. And for me, the discipline of yoga was very strict in allowing, and in fact, specifying that this is what was needed. I mean, we view self-care and time out, or we did at least 8-9 years ago when I started this journey and took my time off. We view it very, very negatively, weakness. And I think that's a very pejorative, aggressive perspective, which I hope we can all begin to move away from. I mean, everyone around me in my work and in my personal circle was completely cut off from their source, and they were slowly burning out each in their different professions I was in tourism, but most of my friends were in law, in banking, in fashion, in decorating in New York City at the time. Another thing that I was given the great privilege of was freedom of time, and also freedom of the body. And this varies from person to person, which I just want to bring into awareness. So, for example, coming from where I come in America, if you're residing currently in a Black body, likely you are the descendant of someone who was kidnapped and brought unwillingly to the United States. I reside in a white body that, was fleeing oppression in Europe. I do know my ancestral history. We were fleeing death quite particularly, but then had to fight for our existence to stay on this land. And I'm sure at the same time that involved killing indigenous people. So freedom to reside in a body is very subject to our time, to our culture. And because in my personal belief system, we have incarnations, I have to respect where I am, and that the freedom that I experience in this lifetime and incarnated white body is very different from how yoga might be practiced by a person of color, as I was describing them, of American background and origin. It's very possible that that person, coming from New York City, we have a lot of Caribbean area immigrants, and they could be someone who freely chose to come to the United States, but who does still come from an ancestry that has slavery in the Caribbean islands from perhaps the French, for example, who are people I was able to mix with a lot in my career. So the way that we practice and the way that we devote time to yoga or meditation is going to be very, very subjective. And the way that we can give ourselves permission to engage in this practice is going to be very, very subjective to how we see ourselves, how the culture sees ourselves. Because unfortunately, the freedom of time and the body are inherently, sorry to use the dirty word, political. And the control of them, again, sorry to get into this, but it is an important part of the conversation, because I can't just talk willy-nilly, in this sort of rainbow, joyful way about yoga, as many people do, even though it has opened up enormous spiritual wells of wisdom to me, which is the entire obvious point of this podcast. I wouldn't use the word gnosis lightly if the practice of yoga had not, through the body, opened up the freedom of spirit to come through and greater wisdom to come through me. But I don't think I can move on to all the level yet until I talk about the base of freedom of time and freedom of the body. Again, both being inherently political, because the control and the use of both our time and our bodies have a great power. There is a great power in freedom of time. There's a great power in the freedom to use your body. Again, going back over a bit of the cultural history that I was mentioning, anyone who comes from an ancestry of enslavement, they know better than I what freedom of the body might entail and how that feels. Women, as well as people of color, when we walk down the street in any given city, we have to think about how we walk, behave, and dress, because the freedom to just move our bodies and the way that we attract visual attention or opinions or judgments, which we can feel, is a level of freedom or not freedom that we experience daily everywhere. And so people of a descendancy who have incarnated in male bodies this lifetime, they cannot quite understand this level of freedom, not freedom, as it feels in our bodies for us. So once again, because freedom of time and freedom to use the body as the individual chooses has a power, the control of our time and our bodies has always been of interest to structures of power and structures of control. Although I'd really doubt that any company or politician would ever overtly put it this way. I doubt that they're actually even conscious of this. But I think it is absolutely paramount to keep that in mind, because to have freedom of how to use your time, and this doesn't mean to have 24/7 freedom. So many people have no time. Our attention is pulled everywhere. And so what I deeply appreciate about the practice of yoga is that it is a practice which says, I am going to create this time for a free expression of my body within a discipline which has a spiritual aim at its core, because it is clearing out the clutter of the noise of waking up with the to-do list, with the clutter of the mind and the noise that comes in with like everything we use on any electronic device, news, work emails, social media, texts from friends, would, could, should, all those things that we do to ourselves all day long. It stops that and just calls you into the body in coordinated breath. Inhale, do this. Exhale, do this. Inhale, do this. Exhale, do this, which is the work of the yoga teacher to her students. To hold that space of like, zoop, all that mind noise has no place here. Let it go. And it is only through practice that both our breath and our bodies finally drop into the permission of inhale, raise my arms up. Oh, grocery list. Exhale, let that go. Stop thinking about it. And for me, I was so exhausted. I was so burned out that I just melted into that permission that was given to me by any yoga teacher whose class I stepped into, be it in person or online. I craved that. And personally, I was unable to give myself that permission. I had abdicated so much of my power about my time and my body over to this image from society that I had to be working to be good, to deserve. And otherwise, if I was not always working to survive, I did not deserve anything. And I was becoming a burned out husk of myself. And so that is why I'm incredibly grateful to yoga, because it reconnected me through the body. And slowly, it took a long time, slowly after quieting the mind, just naturally, this concept of source came to me, and it didn't come to me consciously. Yes, I was studying a lot of philosophies and listening to things the teachers say, but I really didn't understand them, frankly. They were all the gods, goddesses, all the Sanskrit words. They kind of, weirded me out, and I didn't get it. And, sometimes they drove me away from it a little bit. Things that I do daily now would have completely weirded me out 9 years ago or 10 years ago. But because when it is taught correctly, because spirituality, especially in yoga, can be used to alienate and to other, just as any other discipline can be. But when it's taught in a very open way of focus on sensation, as my teacher said, the body feels, the mind thinks, away from thought, it allows the inner wisdom, the inner gnosis of the body. It allows the wisdom of what I will call source to come through. And this is why I like yoga, is because it is particularly what we call syncretic, aka it can be applied to any, well, I'll use the word religion, but that's not really what I mean, but any higher spiritual power concept which believes that, once again, we need a little plug-in for this unit into a greater battery. And we have the batteries of food, we have the battery recharger of sleep, yes, but slowly, the body-based practice with the spiritual aim of the discipline of yoga opened me up in felt, direct, experienced knowing, not conscious mind thought, knowing that there was a source greater to which I could reconnect and find great energy and great, as I say, ressourcing. It was literally like a spring of water coming through my very inflamed, burned out body and cooling me down. And I had to go through the discipline practice of yoga to get there again and again and again. And it built and it built and it built until that connection got stronger, which is why I think this practice is something that can be accessed by anyone of any cultural background, of any religious belief, simply as long as that belief includes that you are a being which comes from a higher source, whether you know what it is or not, so you can be very agnostic about it. So this is why, regardless of who I'm talking to, I do go around sounding very much like a yogic proselytizer, as my friends annoyedly called me when I came out of all my training, because I was enthusiastically, unreservedly saying, everyone needs to get